It looks like Mr. Lee, former Prime Minister Lee, is in the VIP room at a meeting. He will try to be here within 5 minutes, and he has suggested we begin in the meantime. Let me begin with a couple of changes in the program from what you have. First of all, I'm not Air Chief Marshal Tyagi, the moderator. He could not come in the end because of some pressing commitments and engagements back in India. I am Ramesh Thakur. I'm the co-convener of the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. Since this is an APLN session, at this last moment I have decided to step in as moderator myself rather than try and look for a replacement. In addition, unfortunately, we have lost Minister Surin Pitsuwan at the last moment. He also was unable to leave Thailand because of some urgent matters there. This is the former Foreign Minister of Thailand and former Secretary General of ASEAN. So we will have 3 speakers. Although there is a missing seat at the moment, as I just said, we are expecting Prime Minister Lee to be here with us within 5 minutes. What I thought I might do is just introduce the 3 speakers very briefly to begin with, then in a sense set the scene for a couple of minutes, and then have, as we have been having in each of the APLN sessions, and will continue to do so, an interactive session amongst the panelists, and then for the final half hour or 20 minutes with the audience as well. It's a little bit strange introducing a speaker who's not here, but rather than waste time later on, let me start with him. He served as Deputy Prime Minister for Unification, dealing with relations between the 2 divided Korean states, and then served as Prime Minister of South Korea in 1994-95. He, of course, has been a member of the National Assembly, Korean National Assembly, and for a professor, it is always impressive to note that he received his PhD in political science from no less than Yale University. He's also been ambassador to the United Kingdom and to the United States, and he is currently chairman of the board, Seoul Forum for International Affairs, the East Asian Institute, and the Jungang Ilbo daily newspaper. Ambassador Carlos Sorata is the Philippine ambassador to Russia. Prior to this, he was the Director General of the Foreign Service Institute, where we first met and when we invited him to join the APLN. And for people from this country, they'll be interested to learn that he's also been the Philippine Sherpa to the Nuclear Security Summit process. John Tilleman, on the far left, is Director of Research for the APLN now. He's a career diplomat in the Australian Foreign Service, from which he retired relatively recently. While in the Australian Foreign Service, he served as ambassador to Jordan, and he has had a long and extensive involvement with nuclear issues, including secondment as Chief of Staff to 2 Directors General of the IAEA, namely Mr. Hans Blix and Mr. Mohammad Al-Baradei. So these will be the speakers. As I said, I'd like to just begin by noting a few things. All of you who follow nuclear policy issues will be familiar with the phrase and the argument that we have moved from the first nuclear age to the second nuclear age. And what is important is that Asia Pacific is the center of the second nuclear age in many ways. The first was shaped by the overarching ideological rivalry of the bipolar Cold War protagonists, the Soviet Union and the United States, the competitive arms buildup and doctrines of these 2 superpowers, and the development of robust mechanisms for maintaining strategic stability. The site of great power rivalry has shifted from Europe to Asia, which is characterized by a multiplicity of nuclear powers with crisscrossing ties of cooperation and conflict, but also the fragility of command and control systems, threat perceptions between 3 or more nuclear armed states simultaneously, and an overall resulting greater complexity of deterrence relations between the 9 countries that today possess nuclear weapons, so that changes in the nuclear posture of one can have a cascading effect on the nuclear postures of others. For example, the nuclear relationship between India and Pakistan is conceptually, politically, and strategically deeply intertwined with China as a nuclear power. The strategic boundary also between nuclear warheads and conventional precision munitions is being steadily eroded. There is another reality that infuses and suffuses the debate on nuclear policy, and that is that on the one hand we have fewer nuclear weapons today than at the peak of the Cold War, and the prospect of an outright nuclear war between Russia and the United States has greatly diminished. But there are more countries that have nuclear weapons, and the prospect of a nuclear war, either by design or more likely by accident, is much greater between them than was the case during the Cold War. And to many analysts, the least unlikely theater for the next nuclear war is India-Pakistan, arising from a number of different pathways to the thing. Combined with the reality that even a limited regional nuclear war between these two countries, according to fairly sophisticated modeling done by the international physicians for nuclear war, would result in the death in total of up to 2 billion people, both through direct heat blast and other destructive effects, and through indirect effects, particularly on crop production and food distribution networks that will be devastated, and devastated for some time around the world. One final preliminary comment from me, and that is the reality that in Asia we have the different categories of countries that possess nuclear weapons. We have one NPT recognized nuclear weapon state, China. We have 2 countries that never signed the NPT but have nuclear weapons, India and Pakistan. And we have 1 country, and the only country in the world, that was a non-nuclear weapon state under the NPT and has defected from the treaty and acquired nuclear weapons, namely North Korea. So we have the full range of categories. But the result of that is that as per the NPT Article 6 disarmament obligation, China has a legal obligation to disarm, an obligation that was strengthened famously in the World Court's advisory opinion in 1996. India and Pakistan do not have a legal obligation to eliminate their nuclear weapons. At the same time, I don't think, certainly in my mind, there is no doubt, but that they did violate the global political norm against nuclear weapons in testing in 1998 and getting weapons. And of course, North Korea's legal status vis-à-vis the NPT remains very clear. It should not have any nuclear weapons at all and should get rid of all the weapons it does have. That is the situation with regard to the disarmament issue that we are going to address in this panel. And what I'd like to do is begin with questions to each panelist separately and get a brief response of between 5 to 7 minutes, and then have a chance from the other panelists to say something in response, and the original person to whom the question was directed may wish to come back, and then we move on like that to the second and third speaker, and then perhaps have more general questions for them before we come back to the audience. I'll save my question for Prime Minister Lee for when he arrives. Let me begin with Ambassador Soreta first. Carlos, I introduced you as the current Philippine ambassador to Russia, located in Moscow. Of all the people present here today, therefore, you have a unique vantage point as an ambassador resident in Moscow. To what extent do geopolitical tensions obstruct progress on nuclear disarmament in both the Atlantic and the Pacific theaters? Conversely, if the nuclear-armed regional giant, which is of course in our region China, rejects legal dispute resolution processes and mechanisms of which, of course, the Philippines at the moment has some particular experience, is there a risk of encouraging regional thoughts of nuclear proliferation as countries begin to reassess strategic options, either as nuclear umbrella states or as nuclear weapons possessor states?
Thank you, Ram. It's a two-part question. The first part about Russia. When it comes to, you can always talk about nuclear disarmament within the context of two enemies and one potential nuclear weapon. On the Atlantic side, the tensions between Russia and the United States is increasing. The confrontation, not just on the Atlantic side, but also on issues relating to the Middle East, is not abating. Their differences over Ukraine has not abated. There has been some progress on the political front, but militarily, NATO seems to be trying to show its strength by having exercises very close, that's causing a lot of discomfort to Mr. Putin, who has responded by hinting. Well, Mr. Putin's not in the habit of hinting. He does like to state things categorically. And he has not ruled out using every weapon in his arsenal to respond to any provocation. So on the Atlantic side, it's not any prospect for progress on nuclear disarmament is very far from the horizon. Talks between the United States and Russia have not moved on. There's just too much political tension. The personalities involved probably have nuclear disarmament the farthest from their mind. Hopefully, using these weapons are also very far from their mind, but certainly nuclear disarmament is. Do you want me to just finish up? Yeah. Okay, I'll just say, good morning, sir. Just briefly on the Pacific side, fortunately of all areas, regions in the world, the tensions between Russia and the United States when it comes to the Asia-Pacific side, it's where they're least confronting each other. Obviously, someone else is confronting another nuclear power is confronting the United States when it comes to the Asia-Pacific. But it certainly is not Russia. But that doesn't mean that this will contribute to any prospects of nuclear disarmament talks. The thing is, in terms of deployment, Russia's weapons are pointed towards the West. They are probably pointed and targeted to targets in the Pacific, mobile targets. But the fact that there is no confrontation there is least confrontation in our region between Russia and the U.S. Does not mean there will be progress in nuclear disarmament. The Russians have said they want to be more of a factor in our region. They have formally established a policy of looking east, at least economically. But they have also moved some of their naval forces over to our region. They're having exercises with China. They're having exercises with some ASEAN countries. And I guess there is no tension, but it doesn't mean that it will help towards nuclear disarmament. What does that tell us? It tells us that to reach to the point where they will talk about nuclear disarmament, there has to be a lot more confidence, a lot more trust. The absence of tensions is not enough. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Can I just follow up with something you just said? And that is that the Russians are looking to a more visible role and presence in this region as well. If that is true, is there any scope for greater involvement by Russia in trying to resolve the North Korean crisis of nuclear weapons?
That's a good question. Some people say the Russians are turning east because of the Western sanctions. That's because they want to prove themselves that they are still world leaders, and they have said they want to contribute to peace and stability in the region. They have very close relations with the North Koreans, and they have said that they would like to help. But they feel that China can play a bigger role. They feel that the United States must correct some of its mistakes. It's just the way the Russians feel. They don't want to start something unless they're sure it's going to work. They don't want to get in there unless Putin is sure that he's coming out there a winner. So he's laying all the premises now. I think if those things line up, he will take a stronger role.
Thank you. Prime Minister Lee, welcome. We recognize you were caught up and delayed. I have done the introductions and explained what this panel is all about. And the first question, as you will have gathered, was to Ambassador Soreta. I wonder if you want to respond as well to the question about the relationship between geopolitical tensions and A, the added difficulty for actually achieving progress in disarmament, and B, the risks of nuclear proliferation arising from that.
You mean entire region?
In the Asia Pacific.
Yes. Well, there are many ways to consider the question you have just raised. But at the moment, the biggest concern in terms of traditional international politics is a very delicate and difficult relationship between two superpowers, one the United States and the other China. And I've been saying particularly focus is on China because the U.S. has been, in the 20th century, definitely a superpower. After all, two world wars, the First World War and Second World War, made the U.S. a decisive power to influence the outcome of two wars. And in Asia it was true because basically the United States were able to defeat Japan in the Pacific theater. What made this U.S.-China confrontation a new phenomenon is, first of all, of course, a very fast rise of China as a superpower in the matter of last 30 years or so. And you have to make some adjustment to this new phenomenon one way or another. We all know how China has been mapping its strategy as a superpower. But just to think about the U.S. as well, the United States, ever since its independence, going back to the 18th century, so basically in last little more than 200 years, considered itself an Atlantic power, and in fact considered the U.S. an Atlantic nation. And it began to change after the Second World War, particularly after 1950s. In other words, second half of 20th century. So you have to remember this, what people, even Americans, forgot that change. In the second half of the 20th century, the weight, both in economic terms, technological terms, and particularly in terms of population, a shift from the east coast of the United States to the west coast of the United States. By 1960s and 70s, California became the #1 state, not New York anymore. But you know, the economic leaders who are always more familiar with the people's reaction or people's perspective, in other words, the market, than politicians, began to adjust themselves to this new move. I don't know whether you like baseball or not, but for many years, Americans always talked about New York Giants baseball team and Brooklyn Dodgers. These are two legendary baseball teams in the United States. But in the 1960s, New York Giants moved to San Francisco. It's now San Francisco Giants. Brooklyn Dodgers moved to Los Angeles Dodgers. I'm just saying this as a kind of symbolic reflection of the change of internal composition in the United States. And of course, in San Francisco area, the development, new technology, communication technology, and new companies, which began to really bring in a revolutionary changes. So all this change had taken place. On the political side, constitutional change in some sense. Hawaii, Alaska, two states became formally member of United States. So they have to change their flag, you may remember, from 48 stars to 50 stars. And it's not a small change, because finally, someone who was born and grew up in Honolulu, went high school there, became the President of the United States, Barack Obama. It's a big change. So Obama, being someone from Hawaii, and also spent a few years in Jakarta, I think it was during his high school days, he feels the Pacific is his home, not the Atlantic. So it's no accident that under his leadership, and recognizing all the things said in this forum last 2-3 days, that is 21st century becoming an Asian century. To Obama, it's nothing new. He knew it. He grew up in this midst of this trend. So I wasn't very surprised when he announced this so-called pivot to Asia. I think he's far more interested in the Pacific affairs than the Atlantic affairs in some sense. But anyway, which coincided what I had earlier said, that is China becoming a superpower. What we face today and the last few years, and particularly in coming years, is how to make a good superpower relationship between these two and manage the Asia-Pacific affairs in peaceful way. I think both sides are searching. One big difference between this situation with the Cold War situation between United States and then Soviet Union, one generation ago, is that during the Cold War era, U.S. and Soviet Union had absolutely different economic system, somewhat isolated from each other. But Chinese rise to the power is by its decision to become a part of global market. Deng Xiaoping's decision that the only way you can really bring decent economic life for 1.3 billion people of China is to open up Chinese economy and to join the market economy. And he was right. China has become superpower in many ways and second largest economy in the world. The U.S. is, of course, the biggest market economy. So while some people say the Sino-American rivalry is a second Cold War, but it's quite qualitatively, it's quite different relationship. So I have a great hope that the rationale of market economy will have sufficient force to create a relationship of accommodation on both sides, because both sides are calculating what would help their economy in the coming years and coming decades. And here I might add that, again, I've been making this point in many of my lectures and writings, that is, culturally, Americans and Chinese both are commercial people. Basically, it's a commercial culture. They like to make money, and making money represents success. And that's what Chinese are good at it. For example, the Guangzhou and so on, the South China has become the center of Chinese economy. But this is nothing new. People who immigrated to all over the world from Guangzhou area form maybe world's biggest commercial network. So this is one of the foundations of Chinese strength. American, of course, Wall Street and other strengths I don't need to explain. Finally, I have spoken too long, but since I have a chance, I will just add one final point. However, China finds itself historically and geographically a very close neighbor of Korea and Japan. Japan, China, Korea constitute three northeastern states. And in some sense, unless you could have a very amiable or at least functioning good relationship among those three, each one of those three become uncomfortable and uncertain about their future destiny. So there is a circle: China, Korea, and Japan. The bigger circle is US-China. The problem is, from the Chinese perspective, Korea, particularly in this case, South Korea, and Japan are closest ally of the United States. Politically, economically, and particularly security terms, they are the military allies. Yet, we all recognize that our historical and cultural ties are very special and deep. Those three countries still use very extensively the Chinese old characters. So, for example, for last 7 or 8 years we worked together, and last year we came out a new dictionary selecting 808 common Chinese characters which could be used, and in fact are in use in 3 countries, and we're trying to propagate this in the school. Because if you knew all this 808 character, the travelers, tourists going to any one of 3 countries could at least get by. So this is the kind of cultural closeness. And now Chinese have to, one way or another, develop a good relation with the U.S., but more importantly, have to develop a good relations with South Korea and Japan. Not easy, but that's the challenge facing China, and which is directly related to the peace in the not only Northeast Asia, but in entire Asia. Now, I haven't said anything about it, but I think my colleagues have, I'm sure, already said it. The biggest headache China has, others as well, is the big obstacle to this Chinese task is North Korea. The North Korean factor makes it extremely difficult to run a coherent foreign policy or strategic policy for China. That's something I think we can really discuss.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive and encyclopedic overview of the context in which all our nuclear tensions operate in the region today. John, did you want to come in on these questions also at this stage?
Perhaps just to take up one point of Dr. Lee's presentation, if I might, the question of the historic shift of U.S. baseball-led, if we put it that way, shift to the West Coast perspective. I mean, I appreciate the forces at work that you point out. It just seems to me that the idea of pivot is of course very appropriate at this point, but the problem to my mind is that the rate of pivot is not proportional to the change in relative importance of the Pacific, Asia-Pacific, compared to the Atlantic theaters. And to take a particular aspect of all that, I wonder, when the baseball teams moved to California, did the Northeast intellectual heavyweights, whose focus has been very heavily on the Atlantic, move in quite the same dramatic fashion to the West Coast? I mean, what I guess I'm seeing is a long history of huge intellectual effort in the United States on its relationships across the Atlantic, and a very much thinner effort in Asia-Pacific.
We'll leave that as a comment or an open question for the moment, and maybe come back to that. But let me return to a question to Prime Minister Lee. Arguably today, Asia-Pacific has evolved into one, if not the, global epicenters of nuclear threats. Asia is the only continent where the number of nuclear warheads are increasing, and they're increasing with respect to all the countries that possess nuclear weapons in this continent. The situation is further complicated by the number of nuclear armed actors. And of course, the Republic of Korea is on the front line of the resulting nuclear risks, vulnerabilities, and threats. Given this reality, Are you able to outline for us the range and complexity of the nuclear threats as they appear to you, having had a prime responsibility for managing these for your country?
I have to make a confession. It is true that I have dealt with the North Korean nuclear issue maybe for the last 30 years or so. But while we call our region Asian, it's such a vast landmass and so many countries that in Korea, for example, we don't really pay a serious consideration to the nuclear issue, for example, in subcontinent. India-Pakistan contest is a really serious source of threat to in the global scale, but to the Asia. But we are too preoccupied with our own problem. The confession I'm making is that we just devote much of our energy to think about the North Korean nuclear issue and somehow let others to take care of the situation in West Asia. So that's my first confession. Now coming back to the North Korean issue, where there had been so much reports and discussions, I don't really have to go back to this. But the situation is basically a result of what I call North Korean exceptionalism. It's almost by accident, but North Korea, for the last 70 years, has continually become exceptionalist power. In other words, instead of going with your neighbors or going with a global trend, it almost prided itself as an exception, one who will operate on his own way. And the end result is the current nuclear crisis. But here, now, we don't have our Chinese colleagues, so I would rather like to hear from our Chinese.
General Pan is there.
Yes.
General Pan is trying to hide.
All right, then he could explain the Chinese position. But because China is now a superpower, along with the U.S., in our neighborhood, as well as globally, we count so much from China for, if not resolution, how to manage the situation peacefully. And earlier I mentioned about U.S.-China circle and China-Japan-Korea circle. If we have to manage this, these two circles have to meet, not in conflict to each other. South Korea, Republic of Korea, is right in the scene and right in the center. So naturally what we are trying to do is to bring these circles together. For the last 6 months or so, for example, Korea's current government under President Park Geun-hye had decided to join the AIIB, new bank, established by with the leadership of China. We joined it. But earlier, we declined to be the early joiner of the TPP, which is led by the United States. So many Korean citizens are wondering the wisdom of that choice. And certainly many American friends were surprised. Furthermore, in the victory celebration, this is the 70th anniversary of the end of Second World War. That celebration in Beijing last fall, again, the Park Geun-hye herself went there and stood with both the host, the President Xi Jinping, and the President Putin. And this, again, is very, to some people at home, as well as in the U.S., a very strange behavior. But I might say this reflects Korean government's hope to play some positive role to bring these two circles together. Otherwise, there won't be any realistic solution to this problem. The end result, what I'm trying to say is that the situation is extremely serious with the UN sanction of North Korea, so on. But we would like to have some sort of dialogue and negotiation opening before too long, and somehow with our efforts to bring these two circles together, we could find some gradual resolution of this issue, which not only will help the nuclear situation on the Korean Peninsula, but also larger geopolitical tension between U.S. and China, and hopefully will help even such problem as South China Sea. Earlier this morning's general session, all the South Asian leaders, like former Prime Minister Mahathir or the Ko Chok-dong of Singapore, they're all saying that unless you can peacefully resolve these problems, everybody will be in trouble. So we like to do our share, but we need lots of wisdom and cooperation among all the parties involved.
Thank you very much. John, can I raise with you the interesting question of the role of umbrella states? Your country, our country, Australia, like our host country, the Republic of Korea, seeks shelter under the nuclear umbrella of one of the nuclear weapon states as a security reassurance against threats from the nuclear weapons of other states. How do we balance the benefits of that security reassurance, which may be an effective barrier to considering independent nuclear weaponization on the one hand, but risks undermining, by raising charges of hypocrisy, efforts to promote nuclear disarmament on the part of those who already have nuclear weapons, and to promote non-proliferation with respect to checking and containing the interest in nuclear weapons of other states. In other words, is there a built-in tension in the status of an umbrella state?
Thank you, Ramesh. I think this is a slightly charged question, but I will try and deal with it in a pragmatic way. I mean, I think the fact of life is that we have the global nuclear order we have today. We have a lot to thank the the commitments of nuclear weapon states to provide assurances to a number of countries for the fact that the Non-Proliferation Treaty ever got agreed in the 60s and 70s, and without it we wouldn't be in the situation we are today, rather in a situation which is far worse with many more nuclear actors. We have enough, but the scenario we were facing in the 60s and 70s was horrific. I don't want to suggest that all states that are under a nuclear umbrella are comparable. I think it is quite misleading to suggest that they can act as a group of states in any coherent way. No. The situations of Australia, maybe the Philippines, are very different to the situations of Japan and Korea, for example. Likewise, in Europe, the situation of some states in Europe quite clearly are much more vulnerable to nuclear threats and intimidation than Australia, for example. Nevertheless, as a case in point, when it came to whether or not we joined the NPT, there was a very active debate in Australia, as there was in many other countries. We had the technical base on which we could have gone to a nuclear weapon option in a relatively short period of time. We had stacks of uranium, and we still have plenty. If anybody is looking to buy uranium, we are ready in the market. We had the technologies, all of which were very secret at the time. No longer. The IAEA has been in, had a look, and has revealed everything that we did, and there are no secrets there anymore. But the point is, to join the NPT, we had to decide to give up that capability, and we did for two very simple reasons. One, because we made the assessment that a region, and our region, our horizon then, I guess, was Indonesia, Japan, Indochina, and India-Pakistan. We looked and we saw that the prospects could be much better for us, much more favourable, if we could limit the number of nuclear states in that horizon. And that was a prospect that was on offer. Japan, Korea, Indonesia were all willing to commit to the NPT. We went with that commitment with benefits which we are still reaping today, although politicians, of course, forget just what enormous benefits those decisions made by diplomats have produced subsequently. The other element, of course, which made us comfortable to go into that relationship, however, into the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty relationship, was the assurance of some support in the event of nuclear threats to Australia. So these nuclear umbrellas have different characteristics. They can be formal or informal. Ours is informal. They can be hugely important to the strategic role of a country. In the case of Korea, Japan, I suggest they're front and center of strategic situation. In our case, the latest National Defence Report put the nuclear defence of Australia as a one-line reference at about page 200 of a 250-page report, saying that in the event of such a threat, we would rely on the United States alliance. So I think, for one, the umbrella states, that structure which enables some countries to, or under which some countries were given nuclear assurances, made it possible for us to have the nuclear situation that we have today. The number of nuclear weapon states we have more or less contained as they are today. In the disarmament process, and getting back to maybe the topic of our session, is new thinking required to get Asia-Pacific into the nuclear disarmament arena. I think the point to make is that there is no reason why umbrella states, if we can call them that shorthand, can't contribute very effectively to those efforts. On the one hand, we do share a bit of the dependence on nuclear weapons. That can't be denied. On the other hand, that gives us some credibility in the eyes of the nuclear weapon states, so that when we raise issues in capitals, in Washington, talk to congressmen, they're perhaps a bit more inclined to listen to us as countries that have a rather more intimate relationship, perhaps, with the security interests of the United States, to take that example, and therefore we may have our voice heard a bit more. It's also the fact of life that a number of countries with this status have been leaders in various disarmament efforts over the years. And I cite one example for which Australia is often quite remarked, and that is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And just as recently as the last decade, we initiated with Japan an international commission on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, which produced a blueprint for how we could go down the path to zero nuclear weapons over time. So I think there's nothing about our status or the status of umbrella states which prevents them being active in the disarmament process, and perhaps gives them a chance, in fact, to have a bit more influence than some others.
Very much, John. I do have some other questions, but I think I'd rather use the remaining time for interacting with the members of the audience. I'm very conscious of the fact that there is as much, if not greater, expertise on that side of the room as on this side, with the former foreign minister from one of the countries in the region, the former Under-Secretary General for Disarmament, the special envoy of the Prime Minister of India on nuclear non-proliferation, and of course, as was already mentioned, General of the People's Liberation Army of China as well, with a long-standing interest in strategic issues. Indeed, if I may say so, I think General Pan has risen to even greater distinction in his international reputation in terms of the work he has done as an analyst on these issues since retiring from the army. So please, the floor is open. Jayanta, would you please just introduce yourself, wait for the mic so the interpreters can also do their job.
Jayanta Dhanapala, former Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs in the UN and currently President of Pugwash. I have a general question to the panel and a particular question to Prime Minister Lee. The general question is, the moderator began by talking about a distinction between the first nuclear age and the second nuclear age. Is there, in fact, such a distinction, except for the fact that there are more nuclear weapon states or nuclear weapon armed states today, and the theater is still perhaps shifting from the Atlantic to the Asia-Pacific, but a nuclear weapon, because of its sheer destructive power, is still the same, whether it is held by one or by 9 states, and the dangers of nuclear weapon being used are still there. So how much of a difference do you see? The second question, Prime Minister Lee, you made a difference between the Cold War of the 50s and the 60s and a possible Cold War in Asia-Pacific. And you were very keen to show the differences. But in fact, isn't there one common thread? And that is the containment policies which Kennan, for example, began with regard to the old Soviet Union. Isn't that being repeated through the pivot exercise and through the containment of China? And would it not be better to perhaps, for a rising power, to be accommodated in the global system by the status quo's power? Thank you.
Why don't you answer the first question, and we'll let Prime Minister Lee take the second one.
Okay, thank you very much. Just very briefly, there is a big difference. The first nuclear age, ironically, was far more simple. The confrontation, the world was clear on how it was divided. In the second nuclear age in the Asia-Pacific, it's a little more complex. For example, in North Korea, the U.S. needs the help of China and Russia to solve. So they want to be friends, or North Korea. When it comes to South Asia, the United States is competing with China and Russia in trying to influence the policies in South Asia. When it comes to South China Sea, the U.S. is confronting China. So in that simple paradigm, it becomes clear that it's very distinct how different the first nuclear age is from the second nuclear age. That's my quick answer, sir.
John, you want to comment on that also?
Could I just leap in there, please? Ramesh, I think another useful use of that dichotomy is to underline the fact that the first nuclear age went on for, say, 50-odd years and has had all these infrastructure built into and developed over those years to manage that relationship. And to my mind, this is the big difference between the Atlantic scene and the Asia-Pacific situation, that the infrastructures of, for example, NATO for coordination amongst the protected states under the US nuclear umbrella doesn't have a parallel in this part of the world. The confidence-building measures are lacking. The other infrastructure for managing crises, early warnings, whatever else, none of this exists. So what I see is that we have a call first and second nuclear age. The second nuclear age is relatively young and still requiring a lot of infrastructural development to start to grapple with these issues on a regional basis.
Lee, as part of his overall thesis, Ambassador Dhanapala is arguing that things haven't really changed all that much. We're still with the containment policy as well, except the target is different. Would you like to respond to that?
As I said in my earlier remark, that if we were to restrict our examination to the East Asia, there isn't that much really difference between first and second nuclear age, because in East Asia today, every state, as far as I know, when I say East Asia, this includes the Australia as well, and Japan. Everybody accepts most desirable situation being the status quo, that is, China keeping its status as the single nuclear power in East Asia. Everybody has no problem, except North Korea. What North Korea is saying is that they cannot accept that. They like to be the second nuclear power in East Asia. In fact, in some sense, they identify nuclear power as the qualification to be a great power. So in some sense, North Korea wants to be a P6, I mean, symbolically. But all others are not agreeing to that. And this is related to two issues. Japan, for example, earlier we talked about umbrella states. Japan is, after all, a great power, single-handedly fought the war against the Allied powers led by the United States 70 years ago. So it's a great power. But she also accepts China as the sole superpower in East Asia. But if somehow the international system, or specifically even China, let North Korea become real nuclear power, what we should expect from Japan? This is a question we have to consider very seriously. And that's why I think our discussion in a forum like this is very pertinent to the policymakers all over the region.
Thank you very much. I think if North Korea wants to be P6, it needs to get in the queue behind India and Japan, I think. Ambassador Sood here. Just wait for the mic.
Rakesh Sood from India. I think it is a very thoughtful kind of a discussion, and it's a comment that I'd like to throw out in the sense that the way I see it, China faces a double kind of a challenge. When we've been talking about US-China, and I thought your example of Brooklyn Dodgers New York Giants becoming San Francisco Giants and LA Dodgers was a very telling example, Mr. Prime Minister. But I think that at one level, we see China in a sense of also having to deal with regions. I mean, you know, we talked of Japan, Korea, that relationship, and managing in that sense DPRKs, nuclear ambitions or other ambitions in that sense, which for all said and done, I mean, DPRK has a special relationship with China. So China has to manage its region in that sense, in this side. On the other side, if you look at it, its other ally in Asia has been Pakistan, which there is a strong nuclear link, and it has to manage that relationship if it has to find a way of managing relationships with India. Now, so this is one set of challenges which are regional challenges for China. And there is yet another one, which is the global challenge of managing relationships with the big power, namely the United States. So, and you also find this reflected in a dichotomy. I mean, China at times talks about a century of humiliation which it has to overcome. And at the same time, China also talks of the emerging power. I mean, you can't be both. You know, if you are the emerging power, then we cannot talk about righting wrongs of history in that sense. And I think this is where somewhere there is a dichotomy here, there is a dilemma here which leads to not being very sure of how things are going. I don't know if anybody would like to comment on it.
I think we'll take that as a comment as far as the panel is concerned, but I'm sure General Pan would like to present an alternative point of view. General Pan.
I guess that the next time you might design a specific session on China.
Don't need to. Every session, China is very heavily present.
I try to be very brief. I think that, as I understand China's policy or the future orientation of its nuclear policy, would be very much consistent with its no first use. And I think that China's intention, ever since it's acquired nuclear capability in 1960s, is try to put the nuclear things at the back burner of the security strategies of all the countries. And therefore, while it insists on no first use, it also calls on all the other nuclear weapon states to reach an agreement not to be the first to use nuclear weapons. I think that if all the other nuclear weapons agree to this proposal, I think there will be more propitious atmosphere in which countries would have adequate trust for nuclear deep cuts. And therefore, I think to me, in the future, nuclear disarmament actually is a matter of political trust. If you don't have a political trust, you will not give up the role you think is important in your security strategies. Look at U.S.-Russia relations. You cannot expect any kind of progress in a deep cuts in the future between these two powers in the near future. And look at China and United States relations. If there is a kind of a network of anti-missile defense systems, and then I think China would see some kind of obstacles for it to join the multilateral nuclear disarmament, because it might fear that with the less nuclear warheads, its no first use might lose its capability support. And therefore, I think that the first thing for the nuclear disarmament is we must do whatever it takes to try to improve the security environment of the world, the security environment of various regions in the Middle East, in South Asia, and Northeast Asia. Without the improvement of political relations, I don't think that you got any progress of nuclear disarmament. Thank you.
General Pan, yes, Professor Paul Evans here.
This could be, is this on? This could be the shortest question of
That's
this.
Professor Paul Evans from the University of British Columbia.
Paul Evans from Vancouver. I'm going to ask the question in one word. Trump.
Who's the question directed to?
I would ask it to Lee Hong-gu in the context of whether this is rekindling a debate in South Korea about the virtues of South Korea going nuclear. And secondly, whether this would be, instead of rethinking nuclear disarmament in Asia Pacific, the next year at this session would be rethinking increased nuclear armament in this region.
Prime Minister Lee, are you looking forward to a Trump presidency?
Well, like American people, the Korean people really didn't expect this situation develop in the United States. So they were not really prepared to react intelligently to what Mr. Trump has been saying. But one thing is clear, Koreans don't want to have nuclear capability. As I said yesterday, besides Japan, Korea is the only country which really had sizable number of people who suffered the first and second nuclear bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's why in 1991, when North and South discussed this issue, we had to quickly come to an agreement to have a joint declaration to keep Korean Peninsula nuclear free. So this issue is not just a question of unification or not, but this is a fate of Korean people as a people on the peninsula. So the best way to protect the future of the Korean people on the peninsula is not to have nuclear related things on the Korean peninsula, period. So we quickly agreed on that principle. In fact, that year, 1991, we have made a major progress between two Koreas. Two governments have agreed to establish several joint committees. And also, two Koreas agreed to file an application to the United Nations and duly accepted by UN as two new members at the United Nations. While between us, we agree that while we go into the United Nations, relationship between North and South will not be the foreign relations, but special relations until we reach unification to form a single government. What I'm really saying is that, to answer the question of Professor Evans, we just don't take very seriously, Mr. Evans, the suggestion that maybe Korea and Japan go nuclear. And from another viewpoint, Japan going nuclear will create really serious diplomatic problems, not only between us, but among the entire Asian community, Southeast Asia or Southwest Asia. So all in all, we expressed our serious concern. And in fact, I think the message had reached him, so he is backing down now. he wasn't very encouraging this. He just made a remark and wanted to see what would be the reaction. So I think we have a room to wait.
Thank you. I'll just make one comment to Paul's question myself, and then I want to come back to a final wrap-up question to our three panelists. I think, Paul, I am not at all clear in my mind as to whether the risks of additional countries acquiring nuclear weapons are greater or lesser between President Trump and President Hillary Clinton. While Trump might be more tolerant of allies and umbrella states getting their own nuclear weapon, the hawkish interventionist policy that is the legacy of Hillary Clinton and her instincts might well persuade many others to look to that as a means of protecting themselves. So I think that's something we should all bear in mind instead of assuming that on this issue Trump is the problem and Hillary is the solution. The final question I wanted to finish off with for our panelists is, bearing in mind the topic of this panel, is there scope for some creative new thinking coming out of the region that can promote nuclear disarmament both in Asia Pacific and globally? Perhaps I'll begin at the far end and come back to Prime Minister Lee. John.
Okay, well, this is the point at which I guess I would come back to my argument that the consideration of strategic nuclear issues in the region are rather underdone at the present time, partly because the new nuclear age has not been given quite the rigorous treatment, and that goes back to the way it's been managed. The alliances of the Atlantic theatre have been not the same model in the Pacific, where it's been hub and spokes, so a very different set of arrangements, and it's taking a long time to move beyond that hub and spokes system. So yes, I think the short answer is what we need to find is not. It's not going to replace the resolution of the security issues, as General Pan has made clear, then I don't question that for one moment. But in parallel, we need to have a lot more intellectual effort put into trying to find mechanisms which might eventually take hold in the Asia-Pacific region, starting with perhaps some serious track 2, track 1.5 efforts to apply some of the arms control ideas that, if they can be found to be workable in the Asia-Pacific region, try some of the old ones, but looking for new ways of trying to find practical ways of putting in place some structure for security controls in time.
Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you, Ramesh. When I mentioned those three hotspots, North Korea, South China Sea, and South Asia, all of the principals are members of ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum. Yet the ARF was not designed to deal with such nuclear issues. The first time it took up a nuclear issue was 4 or 5 years into its creation, when it commented on nuclear tests, when it just commented on DPRK, on a nuclear weapons-free Korean Peninsula. So there is no mechanism. The approach has been very ASEAN, which is rather to address the conflicts, trying to resolve the differences, lower the tensions, and therefore maybe when we reach that point, then maybe nuclear disarmament can be discussed. But there is no mechanism within us, within ARF, which is just the ASEAN 10. We have the Southeast Asia nuclear weapons free zone, and even there we're stuck, where we're spinning our wheels in the mud. We're trying to find ways to get that done. Next year it's going to be 20 years since the Shanfest entered into force, and we have not moved any. We've had a lot of discussions and exchanges, mostly with China. They've been very open to discussions, but there's been absolutely no progress. Even with the United States saying that they will be pivoting. We took that as an opportunity. You're pivoting, rebalancing to our area. Why don't you emphasize that by, getting on board with the Shanfest? It will be a great symbol of pivoting. Of course, they said that's not part of the pivot, which brings me to the time when they announced that they were pivoting. A bunch of us policy guys got around the table and said, hey, it's great, they're moving to our region. Then we paused for a minute and said, wait a minute, every region the Americans went to didn't turn out too well. but that's just my opinion. So there is no mechanism, Ramesh. It's the mechanisms in the area for our confidence building. It's all non-committal. It's very far from maybe that's one of the differences from the first nuclear age, the structure for arms control to disarmament to verification and trust were all very technically laid out. In our region, I don't even think we have that kind of expertise. We'll probably have to call on John and maybe Ramesh if we wanted to do something like that. Thank you.
Thank you, and very appropriately, Hong Koo, I think you have the last word for this panel.
Well, the only thing I can say is that therein lies the importance of APLN. After the U.S. election, it's not just new president of the United States, but the leaders of all the countries in Asia have to rethink about the dangers we face and what we should do in the coming months and coming years. And so I think we as a group, and also going back home in each of his or her countries, we have to present a strong case that fundamentally we all have to work together to stop any move toward the expanding nuclear armament. In fact, if anything, we have to make a start to go the other way. So I think our meeting here in Jeju was very important in that sense.
Thank you very much. To my mind, there is no more critically important question than the ones that we have been trying to address. I hope you will join me in very warmly applauding our three panelists in helping to clarify our thinking and policy choices on this issue.